Good afternoon and welcome to this seminar on food sovereignty. What I've prepared for you today is a set of miscellaneous notes of a set of projects that are still being put together. The instructions that was given was to talk about my experience in creating projects, the way it is that networks come together, the way it is that you go through the literature and work through the theory, and talking about the struggles and the problems of putting a project together. So what I'll be presenting is not a case of a project that has flown out into fulfillment, but rather some notes of a conversation that is still ongoing and one that is I'm working on together with several colleagues here, both in the university and overseas. What I'll present to you is an outline of several different topics. I'll first do a little review of the idea of food sovereignty, how it links to concepts of resurgence and community well-being. I then want to talk about the different political problems that food sovereignty has faced, about how this particular idea and this movement has become mixed up within different types of zones and boundaries and types of ways of regulating social action, and also how very common sense categories have become very important for invigorating but also prohibiting different forms of activity within this area. And then in the conclusion, under Indigenous resurgence, I'll be talking about the attempts made by different, mainly First Nations communities in the Arctic, but other communities as well, to work on new types of food sovereignty. So I wanted to start with a bit of an introduction. A lot of the ideas that I'm presenting come from experiences that I had as an undergraduate student when I took a year out and lived in a community in northern Canada called Fort McPherson. You may be familiar with this community because this is a community that Rob Wishart and I share, as well as with Peter Louvers, and that we've together spent many, many years working with the Gwich'in community. In this area, I had the privilege of being able to participate with a lot of on-the-land activities of going to fish camps up the Peel River is pictured here, also within the Delta. I've also been taken out many times on the land to hunt caribou. I'm very indebted to this particular elder, Charlie Snowshoe, who shared with me both his experience and his ideas about living on the land, but also his great sort of political sort of intuitions about how to work with the community and talk about efforts and types of interaction that build community resistance. So a lot of the ways that I've approached my research have come from hints that this elder has shared with me and pretty much have structured my career as an anthropologist. And I'd like to offer him thanks for the help that he's given me in structuring my research. I'd like to start this seminar in terms of a definition about food sovereignty and how it links to community well-being. As the bibliography suggests and the readings that I've given you for this week, the movement in literature is founded on work on Latin American peasant subsistence from the 1970s. This particular conference held in Mozambique summarized a set of documents that came out of originally a Mexican movement. The Mexican movement was very much interested in breaking up global networks, in particular corporate control over seed banks, the lack of access to land reform within Mexico, improving the role of women in development. The development of ideas of food sovereignty are summarized in this particular document, and it talks about the different types of policies that are used to reconnect people to the land and to build their sense of autonomy. It was felt that the growing commodification of food within Latin America was preventing people from feeding themselves and creating healthy lifestyles for themselves. And it was very much a kind of a southern Latin American type of movement. My interest in the concept came from the way that the concept has moved from a Latin American setting into more northerly settings, and through that transformation, have itself become transformed into a new type of movement and a new type of way of thinking about autonomy and about identity. The review article by Edelman in the bibliography gives you a very good review of the idea, especially the Hispanic language, food sobrienta, sobriente alimentier, the idea that there's this way that what it is that you produce can enrich your idea of a community, and then he follows actually through citations how different, especially the Mexican government had followed this kind of idea about food sovereignty and how it became translated into the theoretical literature within peasant studies, and then expanded into an international, globalized conversation about how the work of local communities could fit in with the work of states. Oops, apologies. There's a very critical distinction in the literature between food security and food sovereignty. Edelman in his article does a very nice job of breaking this down and says that there can't be a radical conflict between these ideas. However, there is this idea that large bureaucracies and large states are responsible for our well-being, that they're responsible for providing nutrition to us, and that governments around us have a duty of care in order to give us the things that we need to survive. This very paternalist, almost state-centered model contrasts very dramatically with this idea of local communities seizing control over their own method of reproducing subsistence. So the idea of food security, which is often discussed within international relations literatures, is one that's closely tied to the Cold War, to sort of rebuilding nation states after conflicts. The idea of food security has recently become one that we've been obsessed with after both Brexit and the pandemic, when certain types of imports were suddenly disrupted by global forces, and that we're no longer able to count on the import of our foods from Europe and other places that we had been counting on earlier. I was introduced to these ideas by Trina Delormier, a scholar based at McGill University, but also a First Nations citizen from the Haudenosaunee-Kanawasaki Reserve just outside of Montreal. She presented at a conference in Montreal and talked about the way that the Haudenosaunee were trying to rebuild their idea of community through food. This to me, captured more than a decade of work that I had been doing, teaching mainly undergraduates about indigeneity and indigenous rights. A lot of the literature that I used had been talking about very abstract ideas of political rights and about how politics and identity could be described in different types of constitutional documents. Delormier's idea of just doing community gardening and of growing corn and of having small gardens, of reclaiming the land through very small activities, was a very practical and at first a very unexpected way of thinking about these larger issues of sovereignty. And I realized that through these very intimate ways of talking about community resilience, that one could actually talk with much more meaning about these larger themes and these larger theoretical ideas. One of the remarkable things about the Kanawasaki Reserve is that it's pretty much within the city of Montreal, just on the opposite bank of the city itself. The reserve itself has been completely transected and ripped apart by major highways, by the St. Lawrence Seaway, which you can see as a sort of dotted line in the map, of actually this industrial seaway separating them from the coastline and the river that they had used once before. And essentially all of the impacts of urbanization have created a situation where people had become entirely dependent on food parcels or on welfare payments and weren't able to feed themselves much as they had done earlier before colonization. Haudenosaunee were a semi-sedentary agricultural people that they place great respect in the corn and the goddess of the corn, matrilineal society, as many as us know from our histories of anthropology, and through finding new ways of growing food within this urban setting, Delormier argued that Kawanisaki Haudenosaunee can regain their sense of self and project a type of autonomy and community resurgence, to use Tanakaki's Alfred's ideas of how they could regain control over their lives and express their sense of pride while feeding themselves. So the article that I gave you, published within a public health journal, not within a journal of indigenous rights or within anthropology, talks about the interplay of mythology, nutrition, and the way that community gardening works. There's also an online webinar that I've put up the link on within My Aberdeen, where you can listen to Delorme giving a paper and talking about her ideas within this community. I became more and more interested in trying to think about how food sovereignty could be imagined in northern places, and I quickly became aware of the fact that this idea had dimensions that had been ignored within the development studies literature. The development studies literature had been focusing on say, access to land parcels, access to seeds, inputs that are needed for agriculture, peasant cooperatives that would aid in the equitable distribution of profits from the sale of goods. There was very little discussion of other types of things that plague the circumpolar north, such as the way that you can get inputs in order to maintain a hunting and trapping lifestyle, the way that different types of bush foods can sustain one spiritually as well as through nutrition. So gradually these different developments have led me into a search of how to describe northern food sovereignty in a different vein. I see this as encompassing many very broad themes, such as the history of colonization, the way in which different political regimes fracture up land and fracture up spaces in a way that make it difficult for people to access the places that they once traveled across. As I'll outline, the way that extractive industry pollution creates new challenges, how the food that people might eat might in fact be poisoned with heavy metals or materials that mean that the more that you express your idea of sovereignty, the more that your bodies get poisoned by the foods that you're eating. The way it is that particular natural zones are fragmented by the way that industrial states break them up into land and water and different places that are legally separated by zoning regulations. And then finally, these very powerful ideologies of reciprocity and respect, of how animals can be treated respectfully by including them within the feeding circuits of your own family. These are often ideas that are left out of the peasant studies literature and are very necessary for invigorating this idea of food sovereignty within a northern aspect. I wanted to give some examples of this with some of my earliest dissertation work in Taimyr in central Siberia. This was an area that I wrote up in my dissertation and later in a book, and it focused around a regional economy that balanced the interests in harvesting wild and domestic rangifer, wild reindeer. This is an area where Evenki traditionally kept domestic reindeer, that they put them into harness, and then using harnessed reindeer, they would confront migrating herds of wild caribou or reindeer, harvesting these wild herds for food and sustenance within their community. A lot of these deep traditional skills that were also based within dreams and ways of encountering animals within a heightened perception of the land and space through intuitions. are becoming gradually disrupted by industrial expansion, a type of industrial expansion that fits under the idea of green colonialism, since the heavy metals that are produced out of the highly polluting plants within this region of the world go directly into catalytic converters and the instruments that we use in order to make sure that the air that we breathe in Western Europe is clean and safe for us here, while poisoning lands further away. In this particular area, domestic reindeer transport was used by people with these dark arrows as ways that they could make connections between different kinship groups and trade things back and forth. The wild reindeer would calve in the far north, as illustrated in this kind of dotted picture, and then would migrate south and east and encounter people along their trading routes. And then people would encounter the wild reindeer while going through these activities of trading for commodities and food, and then would harvest wild reindeer and use that meat as well to feed their families. This very difficult regional balanced economy came under pressure due to different regional boundaries and zones of pollution. In this particular map that comes again out of my book, you see this expanding area of heavy metal pollution and acid rain that comes out of the industrial city of Norilsk, that gradually destroys the land around it and makes it impossible for animals, even domestic reindeer or wild reindeer, to subsist. And it creates this quality that animals are then spread out in different sort of chaotic routes, leaving it almost impossible for people to encounter them, meaning they become more dependent upon handouts from the large corporation that runs this factory, from the government, in order to try and feed their families. I wrote about this idea of intensive and extensive settlements as a way of capturing this quality of different types of subsistence. So the intensive settlements, such as the cities of Norilsk and the natural gas producing areas of Mesyanka, were industrial cities that created the fossil fuels and the energy in order to fuel this large polluting enterprise. The extensive settlements, this sort of network of small kin-based units around there, were using whatever resources were available in order to try and pull together a highly localized economy that was very balanced. So returning to this old study, I've come back to this idea of looking at the way that northern ecologies can be severely disrupted by boundaries, by pipelines, by pollution, by legal landscapes that separate people from the places that they need to be, and that this lends a very different quality to the way that we can imagine food sovereignty. Working with a lot of colleagues here within Aberdeen, that we've been trying to adopt this idea of food sovereignty to the understanding of food networks within Scotland. And we've done a lot of work on the use of intertidal resources, in particular on the harvesting of seaweed, on the use of the tidal coastal zone in order to generate electricity with windmills, and this what has now become almost infamous as this idea of blue economy, the way that we've exhausted all of the resources on the terrestrial space and we have to move out into the oceans in order to find new ways of feeding our cities and new ways of making a way of extracting resources in order to make our economies work. So the standard models in political ecology and in peasant studies take the legal categories as a given. In this investigation of seaweed industries and of coastal wind farm industries, there's a strict distinction between land and sea. And when you start sort of digging into this distinction, you find that this is a deeply troubling ethnocentric category. So the rather far-ranging article by Angus that I gave you on Scotland talks about the very difficult law of the foreshore. Indeed, it describes the foreshore laws as sort of a topic that the outer sort of edges and the depths have hardly even been explored. And it discusses many different legal regimes, some of which predate the establishment of the Scottish Crown, and then later the union of the crowns between Scotland and England. Ways that something that's called allodial tenure links together the land with the sea, and that in these old forms of odal or allodial kinds of tenure, it was felt that small-scale producers or crofters enjoyed access to all the resources that they needed to put a lifestyle together, from the highest point of land to the lowest ebb of the outgoing tide, and that within this some primary resources such as kelp and seaweed were very important ways that in the past people fertilized their lands, and now provide a resource that is worth a lot of money for multinational corporations as sea algae kelp becomes important for the production of cosmetics and new types of food, and has become coveted in a new kind of marine kelp rush of trying to commodify the ocean and harvest these resources mechanically in order to make new commodities and new ways of making profit out of the ocean. So due to a bewildering variety of historical factors, the islands of Orkney and Shetland preserved this idea of allodial tenure based on verbal contracts and use rights. And what's really interesting is their approach to the way that seascapes are linked to landscapes is very similar to the way that indigenous Cree or even Evenki or coastal Sami deal with the same types of spaces. That there's a strong type of indigenous quality in this way of looking at resources within the Scottish North as well as in the circumpolar North. So this intertidal zone is a disputed space which sparks periodic conflicts. This conflict is now at the top of the news, even during the pandemic, as large companies struggle to gain access to the intertidal zone and remove it from control of local landowners and local crofters, and gain licenses and rights to use these big industrial dredging machines to dredge up the kelp and make commodities out of it. Most of the resistance to this process has come from environmentalists who make a very important argument that the kelp forests, rhetorically, the kelp forests are like the Amazon rainforest, and that they contribute to carbon cycling and to carbon capture and harboring ecosystems for different types of fish and crustaceans. But the idea of local use access has not been researched to any degree at all, in the way that there are existing sorts of rights to land in the intertidal zone. And so this is very much the subject of the project that I would like to design. So my idea was to use food sovereignty, first taken from Latin America and Mexico, later translated into a kind of Cold War international relations setting, and now rebroadcast within a northern frame might be a way to reinvigorate these debates on categories, spaces, and pollution. So Edelman, in his articles, characterizes the food sovereignty literature as burgeoning with contradictory definitions. When we start thinking about the dislocations of the pandemic and of Brexit, we realize that there's a very difficult balance of things that can be produced locally and things that have become staples, such as coffee and sugar, that have to be brought in from outside. Very recently, under Brexit and under the pandemic, we've become sort of obsessed with this idea of local production. It's become kind of a nationalist idea that Britain can make it on its own. But as this article is suggesting, that a lot of the ways that people made do, such as during the war, were just a myth, and that we've always relied on a mixture of international global networks and local resources. So it leads to this idea of what is the proper balance between globalization and locality, and what resources can be cycled locally and which can be brought in from outside. The way that I'm approaching this project is to try and imagine an ecological focus on human-animal, human-plant relationships that is unbounded, unhampered by boundaries and ontologies, that we think of a way that we can creatively restructure the legal boundaries around us. So within a Scottish case, this would be a more flexible building upon the heritage of a legal system that combines the sea and the land together. It might be a way of looking at small plots that during the Second World War were used to build food security, and perhaps under Brexit and the pandemic we could return to the idea of the use of small plots for production. I'd also like to direct attention to how food security leads to regulations and control which are dysfunctional, so that sometimes the constant provision of food and the constant provision of resources disempowers communities and makes them more susceptible to disruptions such as those that we experienced through this pandemic. And then a renewed attention to reviving communities through food sovereignty. So to bring this to a conclusion, I wanted to talk about some of the projects that I had been involved in. The ideas of food sovereignty were developed on the tail end of a collaborative project with colleagues in Russia, Finland, Sweden, and in Norway, which was aimed at looking at the way mainly indigenous reindeer herding societies throughout the Arctic were using local resources in order to battle both climate change and the ways of understanding local subsistence and resilience. This particular project, which was made up of a number of archaeologists, but botanists, laboratory chemists, and anthropologists, was trying to look at the way that very ancient traditional industries could be reimagined to be sustainable and reimagined in a way that can make them worth using within these accelerated conditions of climate change. We moved on from this particular project by organizing a network project called the Political Ecology of Coastal Societies, where we teamed together with a group of Japanese scholars to look at the way that large states either hamper or invigorate attempts to build sort of strong coastal societies. Through our different seminars, we looked at, in particular, the reconstructions after the great tsunami within Japan, and how the federal state was fracturing communities from the ocean by building these huge seawalls, and then compared it to these flexible ideas of engagement between the land and the sea that were developed through Udo law and through these types of very old traditional allodial sorts of ideas of tenure. This particular short-lived one-year project was supposed to lead to a larger project, but we have been unsuccessful. The only attempt that we've made together with Rob Wizard and Janelle Baker from Athabasca University in Canada was to put together, again, a small seed project in order to investigate the way that food sovereignty can be built upon the ruins of an industrial society. So this particular seed project, unfortunately, was derailed by the pandemic and the fact that it's impossible for people to travel here from Canada and possible for UK-based investigators to travel to Canada to work with Indigenous communities. The idea was to work with Dr. Baker and her Big Stone Cree First Nation in northern Alberta to look at the way that local Cree hunters were gathering samples of plants and animals in order to test them for the different types of environmental pollutants, to develop a way of using locally measured efforts in order to discover if food was safe for consumption and not to be relying upon central laboratories and very highly capitalized expenditures. This comes up within the context of the great development of the tar sands within northern Alberta and the way that this oil development is disrupting local communities. Some of the work that Janelle has been doing, I've posted up as a second lecture, a second 20-minute lecture where she's talking directly about the community work that she's doing. And it'll give you an idea, again, about how food sovereignty can be sort of blended into new ways of imagining the relationship between people and place. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your attention. I'm very open to answering questions on this particular topic. I understand that You'll have your own student-led seminar, that there's a number of questions I've invited you to look at, and I've given you sort of a range of different literature to sort of spark that discussion. So I'm always available to answer questions and for help with your own particular projects, and I hope that this particular introduction to my research has proven to be interesting.